On a summer night in 1994, the lights inside a small wooden house by Lake Michigan stayed on until morning. The neighbors knocked on the door, but no one answered. The next day, Melissa Green, a 29-year-old elementary school teacher, never showed up for class. Inside her home, dinner was left unfinished on the table. A chair was tipped over. The back window stood open. Police began searching the area, but there was no sign of Melissa. No forced entry, no blood, nothing that explained why a young teacher had vanished in the middle of the night. Rumors spread quickly. Some pointed to her violent ex-boyfriend. Others said a drifter had been seen near her house. And many still remembered a heated argument between Melissa and an angry parent only weeks earlier. For years, the case went nowhere. Until 2 decades later, when a group of children swimming in the lake made a discovery that finally revealed the truth behind her disappearance. If you want more stories where long-forgotten cases are finally brought to light, make sure to subscribe and turn on the bell so you won't miss the next investigation. Melissa Green was born in 1965 in the state of Indiana. She grew up in a middle-class household, the only child of 2 retired school teachers. Her father taught history. Her mother taught English. People who knew her family said discipline and education were always a priority. Melissa spent much of her childhood reading books, keeping journals, and staying away from trouble. She wasn't the type of child to cause scenes. Friends from her neighborhood described her as quiet, polite, and thoughtful. By the time she finished high school, Melissa knew what she wanted to do. She went on to study education at college. Her grades were steady, not spectacular, but she worked hard. She did her student teaching in small towns across Indiana, and it confirmed her belief that working with children was her path. After graduating, she applied for teaching jobs across several states. In 1991, she accepted a position at Riverside Elementary, a small school in Michigan. It was a quiet place, surrounded by woods and lakes, far removed from the noise of big cities. Melissa packed her belongings, left Indiana, and started over in Michigan. At Riverside, Melissa quickly became known as a dedicated teacher. Colleagues said she often stayed late to help struggling students. She created lesson plans by hand, spent hours marking assignments, and volunteered to supervise after-school activities. Parents, for the most part, respected her. She wasn't flashy or outspoken, but she got results. Several children in her class showed significant improvement under her guidance. Other teachers described her as professional, modest, and careful about her work. Outside of school, Melissa lived alone. She rented a small wooden cabin that overlooked Lake Michigan. The drive from her home to the school took about 15 minutes. It was a simple life, teaching during the day, quiet evenings by the lake. She enjoyed walking the trails near her house, sometimes carrying a small camera to take pictures of the water and the trees. Photography and journaling were her main hobbies. Melissa was 29 years old, single, and not known to be dating anyone seriously at the time. She had broken off a troubled relationship the previous year. Those journals would later become important to investigators. Melissa wrote daily, almost obsessively. She recorded events in her classroom, notes about her students, complaints about paperwork, and her impressions of parents she had to deal with. In several entries, she expressed frustration about conflicts with certain parents. She mentioned feeling harassed and uneasy. At one point, she wrote a line that stood out. "He won't leave me alone." At the time, no one outside her private world knew what that meant. Melissa's relationship with her family remained close even at a distance. Her parents still lived in Indiana and spoke with her on the phone once a week. They asked about her classes, her health, her plans for the future. In those conversations, her mother later recalled, Melissa sometimes sounded stressed. She hinted that work was becoming more difficult. She didn't go into details, but she admitted she was under pressure from parents who disagreed with how she handled their children. Her mother thought it was just the usual struggles of a teacher. She never imagined it could lead to something worse. Within the community, Melissa had a good reputation. Students adored her. Some called her the nicest teacher at the school. Parents who had positive experiences praised her patience and the progress their children made. Colleagues said she was dependable and never missed a class. To most people, she was a model teacher. She didn't drink, she didn't party, she didn't cause trouble. She represented the picture of stability. But behind that surface there were small cracks. The journals told part of the story. A few parents remembered heated meetings where Melissa stood her ground about discipline in the classroom. One parent in particular had argued with her more than once, loudly, in front of others. Some neighbors recalled seeing strangers near her house in the weeks before she vanished. It was the kind of small-town gossip that no one paid much attention to, until later. For now, in the early 1990s, Melissa's life looked ordinary. She taught during the week, walked by the lake in the evenings, called her parents on Sundays, and kept her thoughts on paper in her journals. She was steady, dependable, and careful. And that is why her disappearance shocked everyone. No one could have predicted that her small routines, walking by the lake, writing in her journal, preparing lesson plans, would suddenly stop. No one expected that her cabin, with its lights burning through the night, would become the scene of one of Michigan's most enduring mysteries. On the evening of June 18, 1994, Melissa Green finished her errands and drove home to her small wooden cabin on the edge of Lake Michigan. Around 7 p.m., neighbors saw her carrying grocery bags inside. Everything seemed routine. At about 8 p.m., the lights came on. From outside, her silhouette could be seen moving in the kitchen. She was preparing dinner. Plates and cutlery were set out on the table. Food was partially served. After that moment, no one ever saw her again. That night, the neighborhood stayed quiet. Most homes were dark by 10, but one house still had its lights on. Betty, a neighbor who lived a short walk away, noticed the glow from Melissa's windows when she passed by at 10 p.m. She thought nothing of it at first. Teachers often worked late. Near midnight, Betty passed by again. The lights were still shining, the house still awake. This time she walked up to the door. She knocked several times. No answer. She waited, listened, then knocked again. Silence. Betty left, assuming Melissa had gone to bed or stepped out briefly. The next morning, June 19th, the real alarm sounded. Melissa failed to appear at school. She was known for punctuality. In 3 years of teaching at Riverside Elementary, she had never been late. By 8:15 a.m., her absence was noted. A colleague tried calling her home. The phone rang and rang. No one picked up. By late morning, the principal called the police. When officers arrived at the cabin, they found the front door locked. Around the back, a window was cracked open. Inside, the scene was unsettling. The kitchen table showed a meal left unfinished, a plate half filled with food, a fork on the edge, a glass tipped over, liquid dried on the surface. In the dining area, one chair had been knocked onto its side. The cushions bore no marks of struggle, but the position was strange, as if it had been pushed or hit. The officers stepped outside to survey the property. The cabin sat close to the shoreline of Lake Michigan. Behind the house was a small wooden dock that extended into the water. The sand near the dock showed faint impressions, but they were too smudged to be identified as footprints. There had been light rain earlier that week, and the ground was soft. The access road to her cabin was narrow, lined with trees. It connected to a small rural highway about a mile away. Anyone driving in or out would have had to pass a handful of other homes, but no one reported seeing cars that night. Investigators noted the contrast between the stillness inside and the openness outside. A quiet cabin with doors locked but a back window open. A meal abandoned on the table. No forced entry. No violence obvious to the eye. Yet the occupant was gone. By midday, the cabin was sealed as a crime scene. Officers photographed every detail: the tipped chair, the unfinished food, the window escalate, the position of the purse and keys. Everything went into the report. The atmosphere was grim. Detectives later said it felt like stepping into a snapshot of a life interrupted. No one could point to a single sign of robbery or a reason for Melissa to walk out voluntarily. But the evidence was clear. She had not left on her own terms. Neighbors were questioned. Betty repeated what she saw: the lights on at 10, the same lights on at midnight, and no response when she knocked. Another neighbor said he noticed a shadow outside near the back of the house around 9:30 p.m., but he could not be sure. It might have been Melissa, it might have been someone else. By the afternoon of June 19th, Melissa Green was officially listed as a missing person. Flyers were printed. Patrols searched the nearby woods. A helicopter scanned the shoreline. Dogs were brought in but lost the trail near the back dock. The lake itself was wide and deep. Divers went in on the first day but found nothing. They searched the area near the dock, the shallow coves, and the stretch of water visible from Melissa's window. Visibility was poor. The bottom was covered with mud, weeds, and discarded debris. In the first 48 hours, police interviewed more than a dozen people: friends, colleagues, neighbors, and parents of students. Most had only good things to say. She was kind, patient, and private. But buried in the accounts were small details that hinted at conflict. A parent who argued with her about discipline, a former boyfriend with a violent record, a stranger seen loitering near her home weeks earlier. The cabin remained under guard for days. Officers returned repeatedly, hoping to find overlooked evidence. They dusted for fingerprints. They collected samples from the table, the floor, and the window frame. The results were inconclusive. No prints beyond Melissa's. No DNA. No trace that pointed to anyone specific. By the end of that week, the scene still gave up no answers. A young teacher had disappeared in her own home, in a small town where everyone knew each other. The setting made it more disturbing. A rural cabin, a quiet road, a lake that stretched for miles. The mystery of June 18th lingered like a shadow. The details were frozen. Lights shining all night, a table set for dinner, a chair on its side, a purse untouched, a car waiting outside, and the woman who lived there, gone. The police could not explain it. The neighbors could not explain it. Her family, devastated, traveled from Indiana and stood in disbelief inside the cabin where everything looked normal, but nothing was right. The cabin by the lake was no longer just a home. It was now the center of an investigation, a place where every item, every mark, and every window latch became evidence. A place where a teacher's quiet life ended in silence. And the question that haunted everyone was simple. Who came to the house that night? And what happened between the time Melissa prepared her meal and the moment the lights stayed on, unanswered? until morning. By the morning of June 19, 1994, Melissa Green's home was no longer a quiet lakeside cabin. It was a crime scene. Police sealed the property with tape and began documenting every detail inside. They treated the disappearance as a potential criminal case from the start. In her bedroom, detectives discovered several personal journals. Melissa had written in them almost daily. Most entries were about her students and the usual frustrations of a teacher. But some went deeper. She had written about tension with certain parents and a growing feeling of being watched. One line, written in clear handwriting just weeks before she vanished, stood out. "He won't leave me alone." That single sentence changed the tone of the investigation. Outside, officers examined the property. The cabin sat less than 30 yards from the shoreline. Behind it was a small wooden dock that jutted out into the water. The ground around the dock was damp and muddy, but no clean footprints were visible. The rain earlier that week had blurred whatever impressions may have been there. The narrow road leading to the cabin passed only a handful of houses, but no one reported unusual cars or headlights the night Melissa disappeared. Investigators turned to the people who knew her. The first was Betty, the neighbor who had noticed Melissa's lights burning late. She explained that she saw them at 10 p.m., then again close to midnight. When she knocked on the door and heard nothing, she thought Melissa had simply gone to bed. Betty admitted she had a bad feeling the next morning, but by then, it was too late. Another man who lived a few hundred meters away told police he thought he saw movement near the lake around 9:30 p.m. He couldn't describe the figure clearly. It was dark, and from his porch, the shadows near the water were hard to make out. It might have been Melissa. It might have been someone else. Melissa's colleagues at Riverside Elementary were shocked by the news. When interviewed, a few of them said she had recently seemed stressed. She had mentioned disagreements with a parent who was upset about her discipline methods. The teachers recalled heated meetings where Melissa stood her ground, refusing to bend her classroom rules. Within days, the small town was buzzing with rumors. Theories spread quickly. Some believed Melissa's violent ex-boyfriend had returned. Others whispered about a drifter who had been seen near her property more than once. And many pointed to Mark Peterson, the angry parent who had shouted at Melissa in front of a... Attention then turned to a drifter named Thomas Harris. Neighbors had reported seeing him near the lake in recent weeks. He had been spotted sitting on the dock, sometimes staring toward Melissa's cabin. Police tracked him down and brought him in for questioning. Harris was vague, claiming he had only been passing through and had nothing to do with Melissa. They checked his background, but without physical evidence or witnesses placing him at the house that night, the lead went nowhere. Then, there was Mark Peterson. He was known to drink heavily and lose his temper. Teachers described at least 2 occasions where he confronted Melissa about his son's behavior in class. At one point, he shouted at her in the school hallway. Parents remembered the scene. Peterson admitted the arguments, but denied seeing Melissa outside of school. He said he had been home drinking the night of her disappearance. There was no one to verify his story, but with no evidence linking him directly, investigators could not move forward. Meanwhile, search efforts extended to the lake itself. On June 20th, divers entered the shallow waters near the dock. The operation lasted only a few hours. They searched a small area close to the shoreline, scanning for signs of Melissa or her belongings. Nothing was found. The effort was more symbolic than serious. The lake was large, the bottom murky with weeds and silt. To properly search it would have required days of work and specialized equipment, but the department lacked both the funding and the manpower. By the end of that week, the lake search was called off, leaving an unanswered question. Had Melissa's body been hidden there, just beyond reach? Inside the cabin, forensic work produced little. Fingerprint dusting revealed only Melissa's prints. No DNA from strangers was recovered. The journals hinted at harassment, but gave no names. Without physical evidence, every lead seemed to fade. Within a week, detectives found themselves chasing speculation more than facts. They had a crime scene that looked staged, yet strangely ordinary. They had a missing teacher with no history of running away. And they had 3 possible suspects, each with motives. The case file grew thicker, filled with statements, photographs, and maps, but it lacked a breakthrough. Detectives circled back repeatedly to Melissa's journals. That one line, "He won't leave me alone," stood out like a warning. But without a name, it was just a clue lost in the noise of rumors and suspicions. The town of Riverside grew restless. At grocery stores, in the school parking lot, and at the local diner, conversations always returned to Melissa. People debated who was responsible. Some were certain her ex-boyfriend had come back. Others swore the drifter had been watching her. And more than a few pointed the finger at Mark Peterson, the father who had never hidden his anger. By late June, police had no choice but to admit the case was stalling. They had no body, no weapon, no suspect in custody. They could not prove a crime had been committed, even though every sign pointed to it. The cabin by the lake remained frozen in time, a silent witness to a night no one could explain. The investigation had begun with urgency, but within weeks it slowed. Detectives kept files open, followed up on tips, and checked Melissa's bank accounts and phone records. Nothing moved. Nothing answered the fundamental question. Who came to Melissa's cabin on June 18th? And how did she disappear without leaving a trace? On June 20th, 1994, just 2 days after Melissa Green vanished, investigators turned their attention to the people who might have wanted to harm her. From the beginning, the case was defined by 3 names. 3 men who each, in different ways, seemed tied to Melissa's disappearance. The first was Richard Miller, Melissa's former boyfriend. He was 31 years old, a construction worker with a history of violence. People in the town knew Rick's temper. They had seen him get into bar fights. They had heard about the time he had been arrested after striking Melissa during an argument. Their relationship had ended the year before, but many believed Rick still carried resentment. Detectives called him in for questioning the same week Melissa went missing. Rick didn't hide his anger toward Melissa. Still, investigators pressed him. They asked if he had seen Melissa recently, if he had tried to call her, if he had ever gone back to the cabin by the lake. Rick denied it all. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, and told detectives they were wasting their time. With no physical evidence linking him to the scene, and a solid alibi supported by multiple witnesses, Rick was eventually released. Yet his name remained in the file, highlighted and underlined. His history made him impossible to ignore completely. The second suspect was a man who didn't have a direct connection to Melissa at all. At least not on paper. Thomas Harris was a drifter, around 45 years old, who had been living near the lake that summer. He did odd jobs when he could, stayed in makeshift shelters, and often kept to himself. Residents had noticed him sitting on the dock, staring across the water at Melissa's cabin. More than one neighbor thought his behavior was suspicious. Police found him not far from town and brought him in. Tommy, as people called him, was thin, unshaven, and spoke little. When asked about Melissa, he claimed he barely knew who she was. He admitted to sitting by the lake, but said it was simply a place to rest. Officers searched his belongings, a small pile of clothes and tools, but found nothing connected to Melissa. No personal items, no trace of her. Detectives couldn't place him at the cabin on June 18th. One man in town thought he saw a figure near the water that night, but the description was vague. It could have been anyone. Without evidence, they had to let Tommy go. Weeks later, he disappeared entirely from the area. Whether he left voluntarily or feared being blamed, no one knew. The image of him staring at the cabin lingered, but legally there was nothing more to pursue. The third suspect was different. Mark Peterson was not an outsider, and he was not an old boyfriend. He was a parent. His son had been in Melissa's class, and his son had been a problem. Melissa had sent home notes about his behavior. She had spoken to Peterson directly, warning that discipline was needed. Those conversations escalated into shouting matches. One argument happened in front of other teachers, with Peterson raising his voice so loud that parents As investigators compared the three suspects, the frustration grew. Each man had reasons to be suspected, and each man slipped through the cracks of the investigation. Rick had an alibi. Tommy had no evidence against him. Peterson had motive, but nothing concrete. Police searched the cabin again, hoping for something they had missed. They re-examined Melissa's journals, looking for a name behind the sentence, "He won't leave me alone." They interviewed her students and colleagues, but the answers were the same. Melissa was dedicated, private, and increasingly stressed by her conflicts with adults around her. In late June, investigators brought the three suspects in separately for additional questioning. Rick grew impatient, saying he was tired of being treated like a criminal. Tommy barely spoke at all, giving only short answers. Peterson bristled at the repeated questions, snapping at officers that they had no right to harass him. Each interview ended the same way, without enough evidence to move the case forward. The community reacted with a mixture of fear and anger. Parents pulled their children closer. Neighbors double-locked their doors. And at the local diner, speculation was constant. Some swore Rick was the killer, convinced his violent past spoke louder than any alibi. Others believed Tommy was dangerous, that his silence meant guilt. And many pointed to Peterson, the man who had openly clashed with Melissa, who had been heard threatening her in front of others. For police, the deadlock was devastating. They had poured resources into the investigation, conducted searches, interviewed dozens of people, and checked every lead. Yet the picture remained blurry. Every road led to a dead end. Weeks passed. The evidence log stayed thin. No fingerprints other than Melissa's. No DNA. No body. And without a body, prosecutors had nothing to work with. Detectives knew the case was slipping away. By the end of the summer, the three names, Rick Miller, Thomas Harris, and Mark Peterson, were still in the file. They were still suspects, but they were also free men. Not one of them had been arrested. Not one of them had been cleared. The case had begun with urgency and hope. It shifted into suspicion and interviews, and by the close of that first chapter, it landed in uncertainty. 3 suspects. 3 stories. None of them strong enough to hold in court. Melissa's parents begged for answers. The town demanded justice. But the investigation, despite its intensity, had reached a standstill. And from that moment, the case of Melissa Green began to slide into the long, dark place where unsolved crimes rest, waiting for evidence that might never come. By July of 1994, the urgency around Melissa Green's case was already fading. The early weeks had been filled with interviews, searches, and daily headlines. But as summer turned into fall, the momentum collapsed. Detectives had no body, no weapon, no forensic evidence they could build on. The three names that had dominated the file, Rick Miller, Thomas Harris, and Mark Peterson, remained underlined, but none of them could be held. The investigation had entered the stage every detective fears: silence. Police reports from that period show repeated notations of no progress and no new leads. The case log slowed to a trickle. Officers revisited the cabin again and again, but each search brought the same result: nothing. Melissa's belongings were still intact, her car untouched, her money unspent. The absence of movement in her life became its own haunting detail. It was as though she had simply been erased from the town of Riverside. Detectives turned back to the lake. In late July, they organized another search with boats and volunteers, scanning the shoreline, dragging shallow sections of water. But it was more show than substance. Local reporters later wrote that the sweep felt half-hearted, as if authorities were only going through the motions to quiet public pressure. The water was deep, the lake bed uneven, and without a clear point of focus, the search produced nothing. A week later, the boats were gone. The effort never resumed. Meanwhile, the suspects drifted further from the spotlight. Rick Miller was no longer being followed. Officers confirmed his alibi again and pushed his name down the priority list. In town, people still muttered about his temper, but officially, he was set aside. Thomas Harris disappeared altogether. One day he was sitting near the dock, and within weeks he was gone from Riverside, leaving behind only speculation. And Mark Peterson stayed where he had always been, in his small house, insisting he had no role in Melissa's fate. None of them were cleared. None of them were arrested. All three became shadows on paper, names with question marks attached, but nothing more. For Melissa's parents, the silence was unbearable. Living in Indiana, they called the police station in Michigan every week. They wrote letters demanding updates, begging the department to assign more investigators. Each time the answer was the same: there was nothing new to share. Her mother told a reporter in 1995, "It's like she vanished into thin air, and they've just stopped looking." That frustration grew into bitterness. By the second year, the Green family had come to Riverside themselves, standing on the edge of the lake where their daughter had walked, pleading with anyone who might know something to come forward. No one did. Inside the town, the case became a ghost that never left. At first, neighbors were vigilant. They double-locked their doors, warned their children not to walk alone, and whispered theories in diners and grocery stores. But as the months turned to years, the intensity dulled. People adjusted to living with an unanswered question. Conversations about Melissa shifted from present tense to past. A young teacher who once been a constant presence in their classrooms had become a cautionary tale. Parents told their kids not to wander too close to the water at night, always adding, "Remember what happened to the teacher." The school where Melissa had worked tried to keep her memory alive. Riverside Elementary planted a tree in her honor. For a while it was tended carefully, a small act of resistance against forgetting. But time has a way of softening edges. Within a few years, the tree blended into the landscape, and new teachers came who had never met Melissa. Her name survived mostly in the memories of the students who had once called her the kindest teacher in the building. For the investigators, the cold reality settled in by the end of 1994. The case file was marked inactive and moved into storage. Officers who had once pored over Melissa's journals now worked on other assignments. When colleagues mentioned her case, they did so with a shrug. It had joined the long list of unsolved disappearances, cases that haunted but rarely resurfaced. Still, rumors never disappeared. Some residents swore Rick Miller had gotten away with murder. Others believed Tommy Harris had been more dangerous than anyone realized, and that his sudden exit was proof of guilt. And there were many who could not shake the memory of Mark Peterson's public threat. The absence of resolution gave everyone license to fill the void with their own story. In the absence of evidence, suspicion became the only evidence left. The years passed slowly. Each anniversary of Melissa's disappearance brought a small article in the local paper, often no more than a paragraph. Still missing, teacher last seen in 1994. For the Green family, that was the state of the Melissa Green investigation for 20 years. Stalled, silent, unresolved. A young teacher gone, a cabin empty, a lake holding secrets no one had yet uncovered. A case that had slipped from the headlines into the long shadow of time, waiting for the day when chance, or fate, would drag the truth back to the surface. For 20 years, the case of Melissa Green sat in silence, a cold file buried among hundreds of others. But in 2014, the water of Lake Michigan gave up one of its secrets. A group of children stumbled on something that would change everything. The discovery pulled Melissa's name out of the shadows and forced investigators to face the questions they had left behind. If you want to hear how one chance moment on the lake finally cracked open a case left for dead, stay with us, because the truth was about to rise from the water. In the summer of 2014, 2 decades after Melissa Green vanished, the lake that had once defined the quiet beauty of the Michigan town became the center of attention again. It was June, hot and humid, and a group of teenagers headed to the water to escape the heat. They laughed, splashed, and dared one another to dive deeper. For them, the lake was nothing more than a place to swim, but within minutes their carefree afternoon turned into something that would shake the entire community. One boy pushed off from the dock and swam toward the center. His foot struck something hard on the lake bed. At first he thought it was a rock. He dove down again, this time reaching with his hand. His fingers touched something brittle. When he surfaced, he told the others he had found bones. The group didn't believe him until one of the girls dove down herself. She came back up, pale, insisting they needed to call the police. Local authorities responded quickly. They roped off the area, treating it as a potential crime scene. Divers were sent into the lake. Within hours, what had been dismissed as a teenager's exaggeration was confirmed. Scattered along the bottom of the lake, wedged between stones and silt, were human bones. Some were small, fractured with age. Others were intact enough to identify as part of a human skeleton. Forensic specialists arrived to supervise recovery. The divers worked slowly, carefully placing each piece into evidence bags. As the hours stretched on, they pulled more than bones from the water. Torn fragments of clothing were found, fabric faded and frayed after years underwater. A thin metal ring, tarnished but recognizable as a woman's band, was retrieved near the remains. Later, investigators would learn that Melissa had worn a simple silver ring on her right hand, a gift from her mother. Another item pulled from the water caught attention immediately. It was a small pencil, the kind teachers often carried, its wood swollen from years beneath the surface. A former colleague of Melissa's would later confirm she had a habit of tucking pencils into her purse and jacket pockets, always ready to write notes for her students. But the most striking find was discovered not far from the bones. News broke almost instantly. Local papers printed headlines announcing the discovery of a body in the lake. For the first time in 2 decades, Melissa's name returned to the front page. For her parents, now in their 70s, the news brought both devastation and grim relief. They no longer had to wonder if she was alive somewhere. The question of her fate had been answered. Detectives who had worked the case in the 90s watched with renewed determination as the file was reopened. This was no longer just a missing person investigation. It was now officially a homicide. And the evidence, after all these years, finally pointed in a clear direction. The lighter was immediately sent for forensic testing. Despite the years underwater, technicians were able to confirm the engraving was original and had not been altered after the fact. Investigators interviewed members of Peterson's family and learned that he had owned a lighter with his initials during the 1990s. He was known to carry it often, sometimes even showing it off. For police, this was the first tangible piece of evidence directly linking him to Melissa's disappearance. As word spread, speculation in the community reignited. For 20 years, people had whispered names: Rick Miller, the abusive ex-boyfriend, or Tommy Harris, the drifter who had vanished from town. Both men had been considered strong suspects at different times. But with the lighter in hand, suspicion shifted almost entirely toward Peterson. Residents recalled the day Melissa had filed a formal complaint about his son. They remembered the shouting outside the school. Some even repeated rumors that Peterson had been drinking heavily in the days before Melissa vanished. With each retelling, the case against him grew stronger in the court of public opinion. Detectives returned to the original case file, combing through old notes. The statement in Melissa's diary, "He won't leave me alone," took on new weight. At the time, investigators could not tie the sentence to any specific person. Now, with the lighter found near her remains, many believed the he Melissa had written about was Mark Peterson. The investigation turned back to him. Detectives re-interviewed those who had known Peterson in 1994. The reopening of the case dominated the town's conversations. At the diner where people had once debated Rick and Tommy, the talk now centered on Peterson. Parents whispered at the elementary school, where new teachers walked the same halls Melissa once had. For many, it felt like justice was finally within reach. Television crews arrived, filming outside the cabin by the lake. Reporters asked residents how they felt, living in a town where a murderer might have walked free for 20 years. Some spoke of anger, others of fear. Most expressed hope that the truth was finally coming to light. As the pressure built, detectives prepared to confront Peterson again. This time they were not armed with rumors or suspicions. They had Melissa's remains. They had the personal items recovered alongside her. And most importantly, they had the lighter, a link no one could explain away. For Peterson, who had lived quietly in the same town all these years, the discovery was a turning point. The questions he had once deflected were about to return, sharper than ever. He had denied involvement for 20 years, insisting he was home drinking alone the night Melissa vanished. But now, with the weight of evidence literally pulled from the bottom of the lake. That alibi seemed thinner than ever. The breakthrough marked the beginning of the end. After years of frustration, the investigation had found its spark. Melissa's case was no longer buried in the archives. It was alive again, fueled by fresh evidence and the determination to finally deliver justice. And as detectives prepared their next steps, the town braced itself for the reckoning. Because after 20 years of silence, the lake had spoken, and it had revealed the truth everyone had been waiting to hear. In the summer of 2014, 2 decades after Melissa Green vanished from her cabin by Lake Michigan, the case finally moved. The discovery of her remains and a single object buried beside her body gave investigators the first real lead they had ever held in their hands. It was enough to shake the dust off a file long thought dead. The file was reopened. Detectives combed through the old notes, the interviews, the evidence that had once led nowhere. In August 2014, Peterson was called back in for questioning. He was older now, heavier, his hair grey at the edges, but his attitude was the same as before: defensive, dismissive, quick to anger. He repeated what he had said 20 years earlier, that on the night of June 18th, 1994, he had been home drinking alone. At first, the detectives listened, but then they placed the lighter on the table. A small, worn piece of metal, its surface dull after years underwater. The letters MP still visible. The room shifted. Peterson's eyes flicked toward it, then away. He cleared his throat, fidgeted with his hands. His voice, steady a moment earlier, faltered. He avoided their gaze. The change did not go unnoticed. Investigators recorded every twitch, every pause, every attempt to dodge the question. Peterson tried to claim it wasn't his. He said anyone could have owned a lighter like that. But the detectives pressed harder. They reminded him of the public arguments with Melissa. They brought up the witnesses who had heard him say she would regret standing up to him. And then they pushed further. Neighbors had also come forward. One woman, living just a few houses down, recalled seeing Peterson leave his home around 10 p.m. the night Melissa vanished. He had been unsteady, stumbling, clearly drunk. At the time, she thought little of it. 2 decades later, her memory filled a critical gap. Another neighbor remembered something else. The morning after Melissa was last seen, Peterson's truck looked different. Mud was caked on the tires and wheel wells, though there had been no rain that night. Again, at the time, it seemed unimportant, but in the context of Melissa's remains being pulled from the lake, it spoke volumes. Piece by piece, the picture hardened. The lighter, the neighbor's statements, and Peterson's nervous reaction to the new evidence all reinforced what detectives had long suspected. Forensic experts added another layer. They examined Melissa's bones and found faint but telling signs of trauma. Certain fractures suggested blunt force. The trial began months later, the courtroom filled with reporters, townspeople, and Melissa's family, who had carried the weight of silence for 2 decades. The prosecution wasted no time. They laid out the history between Melissa and Peterson, the school notes, the confrontations, the public threats. They reminded the jury of Melissa's journal entry, the one that read, "He won't leave me alone." Then they turned to the night of June 18th. They described how Peterson, drunk and angry, went to her cabin, how the argument escalated into violence, how he struck her, ending her life. And how, in desperation, he tied weights to her body and pushed it into the lake behind her home. They showed the jury the lighter. They brought in the neighbors to testify about what they had seen that night. They presented the forensic analysis of the bones. Each piece on its own might not have been enough, but together, the chain was undeniable. The defense fought back. They argued there was no direct evidence, no fingerprints, no DNA, no eyewitness who saw Peterson inside Melissa's cabin. They said the lighter could have been planted, that memories after 20 years could not be trusted. They tried to paint Peterson as a flawed man, but not a killer. But the jury was not convinced. The timeline was too tight, the motive too strong, the pattern of anger too well documented. The lighter, the neighbors, the science, all of it pointed in one direction. After days of testimony and hours of deliberation, the verdict came. Guilty of first-degree murder. Mark Peterson was sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. The courtroom erupted in emotion. Melissa's parents wept quietly. They had waited 20 years for this moment. 20 years for the truth to have a name and a face. For the town, it was the end of a story that had haunted them, the closing of a wound left open far too long. And for Melissa, it was the justice she had been denied for 2 decades. She had been a teacher, a daughter, a friend. She was taken violently, silenced for years beneath. In the summer of 2015, they returned to Lake Michigan, the very place where her remains were found. Family, friends, and former colleagues gathered on the shore for a small memorial. Flowers floated across the water, drifting over the spot where her body had been hidden for 2 decades. For her parents, it was a moment of closure. They told the press, "Our daughter will not come back, but her devotion to children continues to live on in every student she helped, and in every child who will benefit from the scholarship created in her name." The Melissa Green Memorial Fund was established that year. It provided financial support to elementary school students from struggling families. Dozens of children across Michigan went on to benefit from it, keeping Melissa's spirit of care alive long after her death. At Riverside Elementary, the school where she taught, a small corner of the library was transformed into a tribute. Her photograph was placed on the wall, surrounded by the artwork of her former students. Former pupils, now adults, returned to share memories. One recalled how Melissa stayed after school to help him with reading. Another remembered the way she quietly slipped extra supplies into her backpack when her family couldn't afford them. These memories reminded everyone of the life that had been lost, and of the impact she had left behind. The town, once overshadowed by rumors and suspicion, found a measure of peace. For years, doors had been double-locked, whispers had filled the diner, and trust between neighbors had eroded. But once the truth came out, the fear began to lift. People no longer had to wonder who was responsible. They no longer had to suspect one another. Instead, they focused on healing. Community groups were formed to support teachers, women living alone, and families in crisis. The tragedy, while devastating, created a stronger bond among residents who had once been divided by suspicion. Beyond the town, the case had broader consequences. The state of Michigan passed reforms aimed at protecting teachers who faced harassment from parents and students. New protocols required schools to report threats more formally, ensuring they would not be dismissed as just words. Meanwhile, Mark Peterson faced the consequences of his crime. Convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without parole, he was transferred to a state penitentiary. Inside, he lived a quiet existence. Inmates and guards alike knew him as the teacher killer. He rarely spoke, rarely received visitors, and spent most of his days alone. His son, once a student in Melissa's classroom, moved away from town soon after the trial. The Peterson family carried the weight of his actions, enduring shame and stigma that would never fade. For the community, knowing Peterson was behind bars provided relief. For Melissa's family, it provided justice. But justice did not erase the years of not knowing. It did not erase the birthdays missed, the phone calls unanswered, the decades of waiting. What it did provide was truth, and truth mattered. Melissa Green became more than just a victim of a violent crime. She became a symbol of perseverance in the pursuit of justice. Teachers across Michigan invoked her name in campaigns for safer schools. Advocacy groups pointed to her case as evidence that threats against women must never be brushed aside. Her story lived on, not through the horror of her death, but through the actions taken after. The memorial fund, the tribute at her school, the reforms it inspired, and the lessons it taught, ensured she would never be forgotten. 2 decades of silence ended with a verdict. The man who killed her would spend the rest of his life in prison. Her parents could finally say goodbye. And her community, scarred but united, carried her memory forward. 20 years of waiting could not erase the loss. But justice, however late, was finally delivered. Out of the pain came change, remembrance, and resolve. Melissa's name remained, not in the shadows of mystery, but in the light of a legacy that refused to be silenced. If you've stayed with us through this story, help us keep Melissa's memory alive. Share this video, leave your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to